It's that magical hour of 7 o'clock. So welcome once again. I am Bill Brown, the Director of Innovative Evangelism for the Baltimore-Washington Conference. We welcome our siblings from the Peninsula Delaware Conference and the Baltimore-Washington Conference as we join together tonight to learn about the One Board model, simple accountable leadership for such a time as this. We are joined by Reverend Dr. Johnsie Cogman, the District Superintendent of the Washington East District of the Baltimore-Washington Conference, and Reverend Donna Claycomb Sokol, the lead pastor at, Mount Vernon Place United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. Before we begin, though, I'd like to open us with a word of prayer. And as I always like to say, bow your heads with me, and I will know if you don't have your eyes closed. So let's pray together. Holy and gracious God, we give you thanks for gathering us together for such a time as this. For we know that yours is a holy time, yours is a holy presence. And even though we are separated by miles and distance, we are gathered together by circuits and wires. For you are present even in our midst on this platform, and for that we give you thanks. We give you thanks for the opportunity to learn something about ordering the life of your church so that we can be fruitful in our ministry. So bless our presenters tonight and all of our participants, that you would give us insight, wisdom, and understanding in the name of Jesus. Amen. As we do prepare to get started, just a couple of housekeeping items you'll need to know. The chat feature is not enabled, so you cannot use the chat. So if you do have a question for our presenters tonight, please use the Q&A feature. You do not need to raise your hand, just ask your question in the Q&A and we will get to it. Also, tonight's presentation is being recorded, and the PowerPoint slides that you will see will be made available. We put those on both conference websites, usually Wednesday or Thursday following our training Tuesday. And so those are all of the housekeeping items I have tonight. I will now turn our presentation over to Dr. Cogman and Reverend Claycomb Sokol. Colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Dr. Brown. So good to be here with all of you today and with my colleague, Reverend Sokol. So we're going to begin with our presentation, and we have a slide show that we're going to get started with. So the One Board model, you have heard it called by many names. Next slide, please. You may have heard it called, well, tonight, let's go back. I apologize. Our time together tonight, we're going to determine what it is, why should we do it, who actually should do it, who does it, and how do we do it? Of course, that's the most important. How do we move there? And then we have some samples. And as Bill Brown said, please use the Q&A to ask any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. So now there are so many names that you've probably heard this called: the One Board, the Unified Board. We've even heard it called the Leadership Board and Simple Accountable Leadership. What shall we call it? There's even a new name that you just heard me say, which is the Simplified Accountable Leadership. Whatever name that you choose to use, it all encompasses a concise ministry board, or a concise board that comes together to order the life of the church. So let's briefly talk about what is Simplified Accountable Leadership. It is mission-driven governing body. It is a mission-driven, and I'm going to repeat that again, mission-driven governing body. It is designed for all sizes of churches, small and large. Everything that we do with the board is aligned with the mission and the vision of the church, and that is very critical. We govern the life of the church, and some people may say we order the life of the church. It is not to manage the day-to-day operations. It is to govern the life of the church. It encompasses the four things that's required by the Book of Discipline: trustees, finance, staff, pastor relations committee, SPRC, and of course the council. You have one meeting instead of four. Although we have the four ministries there, we have one meeting instead of four, where the leaders have a holistic approach to the missional, again, there's that word, missional focus. And everyone on the board is accountable to the mission. Next slide, please. So now, what is mission-driven leadership? It puts the mission of the church first. The mission of the church comes first. Now, we all know in the United Methodist Church, our mission is to make disciples. So at some form or fashion, there should be some type of disciple-making mission at your church. Therefore, we must have the right people in place on this board to accomplish the mission. And those are responsible, that they are responsible, they are accountable. We have small numbers of joint decision makers, and that leaves a large number of people in ministry. I'll repeat that again. We have a small number, which you'll hear in a few minutes, 9 to 12 or 15, of joint decision makers. Therefore, it leaves room for a large number of people in ministry. And again, this model is lay-driven and not the pastor. Now, you know what this is. Let's hear from Reverend Sokol, and let's talk about some benefits of the simplified accountable leadership.
Thank you, Reverend Cogman. Again, my name is Donna, Claycomb Sokol, and I serve as the pastor at Mount Vernon Place in downtown DC. Our congregation moved to the simplified accountable structure 2 years ago with the church conference in 2019. And I have continued to praise God often for the foresight that we had to move towards this, not knowing all of the changes that were coming, but also seeing the significant ways in which we have been blessed and grown deeper in pretty significant ways as a result. What you have on this screen is directly from a book that Reverend Cogman and I have used a lot for this presentation that we will continue to share with you. It's by Kay Cotan and Blake Bradford called Mission Possible, particularly the 3rd edition. We're going to send these slides to you so you don't have to write all of this down. This is their official wording about the benefits. I want to ask a series of questions instead. First, have you ever set goals with your admin board, your council, your SPRC in January because you were required to as part of the forms that you complete for the annual conference? But then when October and November comes around, you can't even remember what your goals were that you set as a congregation. Are you a pastor who only receives helpful feedback from your leaders during evaluation time? Are you a lay person who cannot remember the last time you were stretched or invited to learn something new during a church meeting? Have you ever watched a new idea get a whole lot of momentum, gain momentum, only to get caught up in being approved by one committee and then another, and then another? Do you have more than enough people on committees, enough to gather around a table, but struggle to find enough servants to offer hospitality on a Sunday morning or to help serve your neighbors? Do you regularly go to church meetings that could have easily been an email with multiple attachments? Have you ever noticed new people, many of them who are worshiping with you, either in the Facebook chat or in the sanctuary, but you struggle to remember their names, let alone pray for them? Are you a staff person who's regularly confused about who your supervisor really is? Is it a member of SPRC or is it the pastor? Do you understand how all people want to make a meaningful difference, but they're not always given the opportunity to do so in the church? Do you want to make sure that the people who are making decisions about your church's future are actually people who are fully embodying the vows that we make at membership to glorify God with our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness? And are you aware that most people are being even more discerning right now in how they invest their time after everything that we have learned in this season of multiple pandemics? And do you really long for your church to become the fullness that it can be? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, then moving to a simplified accountable structure is one of the ways that you can make significant change and get on a different track than what you may be on right now. If you look at the next slide, this is the structure for what a simplified accountable, what it might look like in your congregation. So you'll see that the ministries are at the bottom of the structure, led by lay team coordinators. All of our ministry leaders are part of what we call ministry table at Mount Vernon Place. We call our simplified accountable structure, we call it SALT, which stands for Strategic Accountable Leadership Table, is what we call it at MVP, or SALT. So we have our ministries, and we have a ministry table, and then the paid staff and unpaid, it could be unpaid staff as well. And then if you have a director of childcare, if that's part of your structure or part of your offerings in your congregation. All of those people then report to the pastor. So it makes it incredibly clear that paid staff are reporting to the pastor. They're not reporting to SBRC. The pastor is then working carefully with the nominations committee. Again, we know that the nominations committee is the only committee that the pastor actually chairs. And the pastor then is accountable to the leadership board or to your structure or whatever you're going to call it in your own congregation, who's then accountable to the charge conference or the church conference, depending upon who you allow to vote at that time. So the accountability is all set up. Again, where ministries and staff are accountable to the pastor. The pastor is always accountable to the leadership board. And we'll see how that works as we look at a sample agenda later on. Next slide, please. So who is on your team? It's a minimum of 9 and a maximum of 15. At Mount Vernon Place, we have 9 people who are on SALT plus our lay leader. So we've had 9 plus our lay leader. I then attend all the meetings as the pastor. Our director of operations or chief operating officer also attends our meetings, with the exception of what we call the executive session, which is the SPRC component of all of our meetings. In terms of who you might want to call or invite to be part of the simplified accountable structure, I invite your nominations committee or nominations team to spend a lot of time brainstorming what are the qualities of a spiritual leader. So in your congregation, what do you believe are the qualifications or the characteristics of a spiritual leader? Invite your nominations team to really struggle with their definition of a spiritual leader, those qualities, those characteristics, those disciplines, and then begin to put a list together of the people in your congregation that you believe have those qualities or those characteristics or that discipline. We always ask at MVP, who are the people who are growing as disciples of Jesus Christ? Who are the people who are worshiping regularly? Who are the people who are growing in faith through participation in a small group or a class? And especially, who are the people who are embodying regular, intentional, and generous financial giving? I do not believe that anyone should be on your main board if they are not working towards tithing or growing as givers. We cannot be accountable to or help other people be accountable to the vows that we take at membership if we ourselves are not being accountable to that as well. So we make sure that the people who we nominate are people who we believe are fulfilling the vows that we take at membership as faithfully as possible. We also look at conflict of interest. We want to make sure that there are no family members of staff members who are serving on the main team, since the main team also provides the leadership that an SPRC would in a local congregation. We also pay very close attention to very close established friendships amongst a church member or a staff member to see if there would be a conflict of interest there. And as I said too, the ministry table then is our ministry leaders, which is then separate from SALT in terms of the kind of leader that is needed. Next slide. Dr. Cogman.
Thank you, Reverend Sokol. So you now know what it is. You know that it is mission driven. You know who should be up there, some of the characteristics. But how do we do this? Your church has been hearing about it. The pastor's been talking about it. Maybe even the district superintendent hinting around. But how do we transition from the current structure that we have to where we are? This is what I do in my district. And again, we got this information as we were studying the book that was referenced, as it was also put in the chat. So the first thing that we encourage you to do is to review your mission. That is your why. What is your mission? What is the church's mission? And then pray, pray, and pray and discern. Allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you as to a body of believers as to how we're moving to this next structure. The next thing is that the pastor and the council chair, the current council chair, communicates with the district superintendent about changing the governance structure. So you have a conversation with the DS to let the DS know that we are in a period of prayer and discernment of moving from where we are to the one board, to the leadership board, to the simple accountable structure. Then after that, the council comes together and communicates with and receives congregational feedback, and that is very important. We want the congregation to have input through the council as to where they see the church going, making sure that the congregation knows the mission, as well as there may be members in the congregation currently not serving on leadership, but may want to complete the leadership interest form, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and they will be able to come on the one board model or the nominations. So they receive the congregational feedback, and then the council approves the new structure. After that, the nominations and leadership, which of course is chaired by the pastor, continues to work to develop the leaders. So there may be people who are coming forward that have skills and abilities that we were unaware of, or those who said, I feel that God is calling me to something new and I want to try something new. So that's where nominations and leadership works together to develop these leaders. Then the council approves the leaders for the new governing structure. And as Reverend Sokol said, it's 9 people, a minimum. Max is 15, depending on the size of your church, 9 to 15. So there's a list, there's an actual body, a list that is presented in the last step to the district superintendent. And the district superintendent, at the request of the pastor, convenes a charge conference. And then we approve the new leaders, put them in training, and away we go. So it's very, it's not hard, but it is something that you really want to take serious before you move into this. And you want to make sure that you know your mission, you pray, you discern, and then you transition. Next slide, please. Please do not forget to use the question and answer feature. So if you have questions as we go along. So here's some fun facts to remember as we were looking at our resources. That the one board members, just like with the Book of Discipline and our normal traditional leadership structure, we serve a 3-year term. We serve a 3-year term. So therefore, you can have rotations to make sure. So now what does that mean? So when we start this one board model, somebody's going to come in and serve only 1 year. Somebody's going to serve 2 years, and somebody's going to serve 3 years, so that you will have a good even rotation. Everybody just doesn't come in and serve for 3 years and then they're gone. So each member has 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years as you begin. The same rules apply in reference to the immediate family members not serving together, which is what Reverend Sokol just said a few minutes ago. We do not want to have a conflict of interest. And depending on the size of your church, that is something that you would discuss with your district superintendent. We will have a building maintenance team, and that is different from the board of trustees because we do have to maintain our resources, our buildings, and other things like that. So make sure that we have a building maintenance team that is there, which is different than the board of trustees. Next, another fun fact is nomination and leadership are separate from the one board model, one board. So therefore, if you have persons that are serving on the nominations and leadership development team, they cannot serve on the one board at that particular time. Everybody has their own individual instructions or guidelines that they're supposed to be following. So the nominations and leadership development are separate from the one board. The one board can delegate responsibility, but never advocate responsibility. So you can delegate it, but you can never abdicate it. And then here's very important. SPRC meetings, or they may be called executive sessions, as Reverend Sokol does, they are closed and confidential. What does that mean? That means when the one board comes together, we may be talking about finances. So at that particular time, the 9 of us, the 12 of us, the 15 of us, we become the finance team, and we handle the business of the finance. And people who want to come and sit and have no voice and no vote, but they're listening and learning, then they are able to come. But then there becomes a staff issue, or there becomes something with the SPRC or the executive session that we have to have a discussion about. Then that meeting becomes closed. So those who were visiting, those who were listening to learn, now have to leave the room or leave the Zoom, depending on how you're having your meeting, because they are closed and confidential. And that goes back to what Reverend Sokol says about the people that you have on this one board. You want to make sure that they are capable of maintaining confidentiality in all areas. The minimum number that she just said was 9, max is 15. Of course, the optimum number could be 12 in the middle. Now, you can provide your congregation members with a leadership board interest form. So if you have this book, and we do encourage you, if you don't have the book, but we can actually send this to you if necessary, it's on page 247. And it is a leadership interest form that lets people tell you if they're really interested in a leadership position. So just to give you some idea of what it is, of course, name and address, but then ask you, are you part of a small group? Are you part of a Sunday school class? It asks you which service do you attend? And the rationale, of course, Reverend Sokol says, is we want to make sure that we have people that are actively involved in the life of the church. It asks you, how long are you willing to serve? Are you the one that can come on, I can serve 3 years, or I want to be the first one to come off? And then, are you available for a leadership retreat? Are you available for training? So this is the leadership board interest form that would be great for other people in the congregation who may not be serving to complete, so that you will have a good plethora of people to choose from for the nominations and leadership board to interview. And finally, you want to make sure that you have some guiding principles. In this book, again, on page 262, the author gives some great guiding principles. You can use those as a springboard for yours, but you want your guiding principles to really hone in or fit your specific church setting. What is it that you really need? What is it that is very important? Those are the guiding principles. I see some questions in the Q&A that will be answered through the guiding principles. So make sure that you have some written guiding principles so that everybody on the board will be on the same page as we go through there. Next slide, please. Reverend Sokol.
Thank you, Reverend Cogman. So this is a sample agenda. This is the agenda that we use for our SALT meetings at MVP. SALT meets once a month. We schedule our meetings for 2 hours once a month, with the full meeting scheduled for an hour and a half, an executive session typically scheduled for 30 minutes, unless there's something more significant that needs to happen during that time. That we always start with a brief opening prayer. You'll then see that the bulk of the time is spent on spiritual formation and leadership development. So we may be looking at a passage of scripture together and doing Bible study together. Most recently, there was an article floating around on social media. That's where I saw it first, called "They're Not Coming Back," which talked about how pastors and lay people may be really hoping that people are going to come back to our churches as we continue to emerge from the pandemic. It was a very provocative article, with the title alone being "They're Not Coming Back." And so to really dig deep into thinking about how much has the church changed over the last 20 months, we spent a lot of time thinking about how much the church has changed and the amount of change that is required from us and by us in response to that. So we're really learning, we're seeking to learn together, to be able to grow together as leaders and as disciples in what we look at in those two areas of spiritual formation and leadership development. I, as the pastor, then always present a list of new people who have been joining us online, who have either been commenting in the Facebook chat or who have completed an online connect card to let us know that they've been with us, or people who are new, who have been in the sanctuary. If they've come with us, if we're right on the verge of an agenda and someone's only been with us once, I'll go ahead and list them. Most of the time I'm listing people who have visited or worshiped with us at least twice. And so prayerfully, that list is growing as we continue. But then people are able to see that list. I really want to take that a next step further as we transition to a new team in January, to thinking about how do we then spread out those names where we are intentionally praying and have people intentionally praying for those new people who have been in our midst, either in our online community or in-person community. I then report on the goals that we have set. In some years, we set those goals in December, other years we set them in January. And so at every single meeting, we are holding ourselves accountable to say, these are the goals that we set for this year together. And this is the progress that's being made in these goals. And so the accountability is there at every single conversation. What is it then if we're not meeting these goals? What is it then that I, as the pastor, need to do differently? What is it that our lay people could be doing more of or less of to be more helpful? How are we going to continue to work to achieve these goals? Then pressing issues and problem solving is often the bulk of what our meetings are, but prayerfully, that's a really small part of it. Unless it's something, if we're doing the budget meeting may be a whole lot longer in that area, the pressing issues and problem solving. If we're doing the pastor evaluation, that area might be a lot longer, but we're really trying to limit the amount of time that is spent on problem solving and pressing issues, and really focusing on the accountability, on the development, on the growth as leaders, and how our church is seeking to make a difference and whether or not we're actually accomplishing that. The other thing, I can't tell you how many church meetings that I've been to that could have been an email. So oftentimes we have church meetings and I've already been sent the report that someone then just reads to me. So we try to get all of that information out. At least our goal is to get it to people a week in advance. And that also includes the financial report. So people receive a report from me. They receive a report on where we are with the goals. They might receive a report on something that's happening in the building or needs attention in the building. A repair or an opportunity along those lines, and the financial report. They're asked to review that before we come together, send questions in advance. And so then we're able to quickly go through that, again, to keep all of the biggest bulk of the emphasis on the main thing. Then the last part, or next to the last part, communications, is so critically important. How are we being as transparent as possible to the congregation? So then we go back and look what was decided tonight by our team, by our board, who needs to know, and who will tell them, or how are we going to tell them? After every meeting, we then send a brief synopsis in our weekly email. So people have a brief synopsis of what happened at the meeting. But then we also, again, want to challenge ourselves on making sure that we're being as transparent as possible and seeking to communicate as much as possible. And then there's the closing prayer. We always keep the executive session on our agenda at MVP. I know that doesn't happen everywhere. But I try. Some of the greatest continuing education I've ever done is to serve on the board of a nonprofit or the board of my seminary. And all of those meetings end with a time when the board can express gratitude and affirm the leader, and the leader can express gratitude and affirm the board. And so if the only thing that happens in the executive session is for your pastor to hear thank you, or for you to pray for your pastor, don't ever, ever underestimate that. And especially in this season where so much of the church has changed and where the sources of joy aren't always as plentiful as they used to be. And so if we can get into the habit of simply, if there's not information to be shared in the executive session, to simply use it as a time of gratitude and affirmation and encouragement and accountability. So I'll use that session too in my pastor's report to say, I don't see a lot of you really helping with hospitality right now, and we need to dig deep and to think about that. Or how are you growing and what's happening so that we can also continue to push one another. We may be talking about a staffing opportunity. If there's a staff or a team member that may not be performing as well as we had imagined, we might talk about that, or any other questions or comments that's coming from the report. The other reason why I like to keep it on the agenda at all times is then if it's only something that happens once every 2 or 3 months or once every 6 months, then some people might be thinking, oh no, what's up? If you do have guests at SALT or at your board meeting, then why are they going into executive session? Or a staff member might think, oh my goodness, why is this happening? So we keep it on the schedule. And again, if it's only a prayer, where your pastor's getting to hear thank you and affirmation, and you're getting to offer that to your team as a pastor, I think it's well worth the time. Next slide. Dr. Cogman?
So this is the book that we have used for our resource this evening, as I held it up earlier. And many of you wanted to know where you could get it. And of course, you can get it at Cokesbury, Amazon, any of the book distributors, they're there. And we recommend that you get it. And again, use it to fit your particular context, because there's a lot of information in there, especially the appendixes, a lot of the great examples that we were just showing you a few minutes ago. All right, so let's go to our next slide, which I think is the most important. We have given you a lot of information, and a lot of this has come from personal experience from Reverend Sokol, as well as myself and the various churches that I have in the Washington East District of the Baltimore-Washington Conference that have used it. So now is your time to ask questions, and I know that Bill Brown is going to assist us. We will answer them as best as we can. And if we don't know, we're going to say we don't know, but we will find the answer for you. Okay, so let's begin, because this is where we really...
Alrighty. So I'm going to ask a question that may or may not be related, but this person asked early on. And so this may be for you, Dr. Cogman.
Okay.
Under a current model that is not a simplified leadership, accountable leadership model, are the trustees and treasurer required to get approval from the board for all expenditures, including emergencies?
Okay, thank you so very much for that question. So the answer I would say is yes, because that will be part of your guidelines. Everything that you have when you're spending funds has to have some form of accountability. So therefore, if there is an emergency, what would it be in your guidelines? What would your guidelines say about an emergency spending of funds? Otherwise, you would go through your normal channels, and yes, it would come before the board. So make sure that that is included in your guidelines.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions from people serving 2-point charges. And basically, I'm combining some questions. A, can this structure work on a 2-point charge? And I have to scroll down. And more specific, so that's question 1. A follow-up from a different person is, they're on a 2-point charge. They have separate church administration, except they have a shared SPRC. So how could they do as one board? And that, like, if one church has a one board model, but they want to then meet with as an SPRC with both churches, could they do that? And if so, how?
So, Reverend Sokol, I'll take that one first, because I actually have that in my district right now. I hope it's not one of my pastors asking that question. The answer to your question is yes, it definitely can be done. So I actually have a 2-point charge where they came together because they have one pastor. and their SPRC currently is combined. And they do have other things that are separate. So yes, that the second half of that is that can be done. You could have that. However, if you want to go to the simplified accountable leadership model or the one board model, the unified board model, then you can still have both churches of the 2-point charge to come together to have one charge, one board for that entire charge for both churches. So they can come together, not just SPRC, but when they come together, they come together as SPRC, finance, trustees, council, and they take care of both churches with one pastor. So it would really behoove them to come together as one.
Now we've had, again, several questions from some of our smaller churches, which I would say are many of our churches across both annual conferences fall into that category. We have one question that they have a small congregation, 25 to 30 members, and the same people are on 2 or 3 committees. Would this model be necessary as it would be the same leaders? I'm going to just hand you that softball, let you hit it out of the park.
Okay, I feel like this is all on me, Reverend Sokol, but yes, the answer is yes. This initially, book of discipline paragraph 247.2 originally was for the smaller churches. But as they found that the larger churches began to implement this. So if you have a small congregation, this definitely is for you because you have the same people that are in SPRC and finance and trustees. So I tried to make a little diagram that when I took Kay's class, she showed us, but I think I ran out of paper. So I'm going to see if I can do this so you can actually see how this works. Oh, no, I do. Okay, so here we go. So because I have a small church or I have a large church, those who come on finance, we will become the finance team. Can y'all see this? So when we have an issue, everybody comes together, we're on finance. But then there's something else we need to do that then we change and we become trustees. Okay, so we've gone from finance to trustees. And then there's something we need in general, then we become members of the council. And then if there's a staff issue or something like Reverend Sokol talked about, the executive session where we have to go close, then we become the SPRC. So we become all things to all people so that we may win what? Some. Okay, so it is great for smaller churches. That way the same people will come together instead of having SPRC on Monday night, trustees on Tuesday night, finance on Wednesday night, and it's the same people coming out. Or I had one church that would start at 5 o'clock and not finish until 9. Same people. We would start with the trustees at 5. We would go to finance at 6. We would go to council at 7. We go to SPRC at 8. Same people, but different things. So why not just come together for 1 hour and take care of all of the business? So I hope that helps.
So let me repeat back what I hear you saying. And I think from the practical, I want to get confirmation from Reverend Claycomb Sokol as well. So basically what I hear you saying is in this one board model, everyone is simultaneously members of SPRC, finance, trustees, and church council, and they just kind of put on a different hat depending on what's being discussed at the time.
Yes. Reverend Sokol?
Or I would say they keep the same hat, which is love of God and love of neighbor. And how's the church going to accomplish that? Which includes the totality of all of these different groups.
So you're really emphasizing the ministry in administration.
Very much so.
Excellent. Now, how do you deal with this? What if the nominations committee is non-functional? They haven't met in at least 3 years. How do you implement this model successfully?
I would encourage that pastor, whoever that is, or maybe it did come, I shouldn't assume it came from the pastor. Maybe it did come from a lay person. If it's coming from a lay person, I would encourage your pastor to work with you to nominate and establish a nominations committee. If you're the pastor, I think being the lead of the nominations committee is one of the greatest privileges that we have as pastor, because we get to work with people to help identify their gifts and their passions and to help them to find their place of mission and ministry and service within the congregation. And so to not have a nominations and leadership development committee is robbing people of the privilege and the joy of sharing their gifts and shining their light. So I would encourage you to look and see. Reverend Cogman, you know better than me, what's the minimum number of people on a nominations team according to the Book of Discipline? What do you know the minimum number?
I don't know the minimum number right offhand, but
okay.
Yeah. So, but I want to add on what you said is that a lot of times people focus on the word nominations and they miss the leadership development, which is what Reverend Sokol was saying. So it is very important that you have a nominations and leadership development, because they're working throughout the year to develop the leaders to help us fulfill that mission, not just nominate, but it's nominations and leadership development.
So people are still, I think, trying to wrap their minds around this. For some, this is a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different way to look at the ministry of administration. So somebody said with that all the committees, so if you have this SALT team, if you have this single leadership board, there are no longer, they're asking what, do the other committees like finance trustees and SPRC still keep meeting? And do they elect to the SALT board, which is an oversight board? But what I hear you saying is this, what in Donna's case, the SALT team table replaces all of those. There are no other administrative committees. They're, for lack of a better word, absorbed into this one body of 9 to 12 people who make all of the policies and decisions around the things that trustees, SPRC, finance, and council did. And the only other committees are really ministry teams then that are meeting, like somebody who is interested in building maintenance, or somebody who's interested in mission, or somebody who's interested in Christian education. They still meet and plan their ministries, correct?
Yeah, and your nominations.
And your nominations. That is the only other administrative committee. Okay.
So that's why Bill 2, so much careful discernment is needed, and communication to take this step. And it's not a step that will be easy for everyone in your congregation. And particularly if you go from having a full SPRC, a full trustees, and a full finance, some of the people who serve on those committees, who really love serving on those committees, are not going to be on your main leadership team when you initially make that transition. And so it can be a very hard transition to make at first, and there will be some people who will not understand it. And so the more careful discernment and above the board discernment in terms of communication, as far as bringing people together and bringing them along in the conversation, will be very, very, very important. You're also going to have, as you move towards it, you'll have people who are selected to serve for 3 years, people who are selected to serve for 2 years, and people who are selected to serve for 1 year as you set up your 3 different classes. So it's also a lesson in trust as you continue to nominate people who you believe are faithful spiritual leaders, but also how do you continue to trust these people? It's not a power grab. It's not about control, but it's about helping your congregation do everything they can to make disciples of Jesus Christ.
Okay, we're going to still wade into this, because I think it's getting, but based on the questions I'm getting, it's getting clearer, but we're still, how do you differ between a building maintenance team and the trustees? And if you have a building maintenance team, who manages that?
Do you want me to take that, or you got it?
Go ahead, please.
So a building maintenance team is basically what it says. It's a group of, they could be members of the trustees at that particular time, or it could be other people that have an interest, that have filled out a leadership interest form, that help to maintain the building. Something like changing the light bulbs, or nailing down a pew, or making sure that the railing is safe, or something like that. That's building maintenance. The trustees, of course, and we know that they have a whole separate section in the Book of Discipline. They are represented or become the one board model becomes the trustees when that is necessary. So you have a separate group that actually handles the maintenance of the buildings or the grounds, you know, whether it's snow removal or it's grass cutting. And then you have this team called the One Board, the Unified Board, the Simple Accountable Leadership Board that comes together to handle trustee matters that are necessary at that particular time. So two separate entities, both vital for the church.
And I think it's safe to say, a building maintenance team, they don't have to be elected. These are people who have a passion, interest, giftedness, skill,
Exactly.
calling to
Yes.
change light bulbs.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Mhm.
We're going to keep. Somebody has an interesting question. How did we get the system we currently have of all of these different committees?
I would love for that person to do a research project and report back.
I was gonna say,
Okay, she know, and I can say she because I have privy to the information. I'm not going to call them out, but you have homework. My question asker, we've been dialoguing to get this question right. You've got homework to. I have my suspicions of how we got to this point, but you have homework to figure that out because, you know, we've always done
and
it.
come
that
back
way.
and let us know,
But
right?
I also think too, Bill, we could answer that question, right? The church needs finances to operate. Like we can't do mission and ministry without finances. And there has to be wisdom and discernment in how to be good stewards of that. We have buildings and other resources that we have to be good stewards of. And so we need people to help us with that. We have a call and a claim prayerfully that God has placed upon each of our congregations. And so we have to figure out how do we fulfill that? What is the role that God has called us to play at such a time as this? And how are we going to do that? And we have people who are being paid by the church to do particular work. In some cases, it's only the pastor. In some cases, it's a pastor and a staff. And so how do we hold that person, the pastor, accountable? And how do we make sure that we are creating the best staff team possible? And so when you think about that, of course, we need people to do these things. But then the question is, how many people do we need to do these things? And what does their work look like to accomplish that?
Every time I think we answer a question, we get three more that just kind of veer off. So we have some legal experts. We have some of the best participants of any broadcast. So we have some legal experts who are curious. Different states have different laws and rules, particularly around trustees. I know since I have served on conference trustees, there is in the state of Maryland a required that the trustees be elected as trustees. Every January, they have to elect their officers. Is that done as part of the one board, that they're all elected as trustees once a year to meet those state requirements?
Reverend Cogman, I know in Kay's book, she talks about that you need to make sure that the chairperson is elected chair of the trustees at your very first meeting. So whoever the chairperson of your board is, that you also need to make sure that that person is elected chair of the trustees to speak on behalf of the church and to fulfill some of those legal documents. I know that's also been a question that's come up in the comments, is who is the chairperson? Our nominations committee also selects the chairperson of SALT. And so the nominations team discerns that and presents that to our annual church conference to be voted on. This past year, we also nominated a SALT chairperson designee. And so for that transition, so that the person, our first SALT chair would then serve 3 years prayerfully, but then we would have the chair-elect come in to know that they would be taking over, that they would join the board this upcoming year in 2022, and with the plan of them becoming the chairperson in 23. But to have that hat on and that lens to be thinking, okay, I'm going to be leading this group in 2023. And I'm really, really thankful that we went ahead and did that. As it turns out, our current chair is going to be moving to a different state. And so I'm so thankful that we had that foresight as well. But our nominations team is also the one that selects and presents to church conference who the chairperson should be.
Now, what about other current responsibilities that are taking place in the church? So is there a financial secretary? And if there's a financial secretary, do they serve on this simple accountable board? Does the treasurer serve? Is there still a lay leader, a lay member to annual conference? So those kinds of disciplinary required offices, are they still in effect, and do they serve on this simplified board?
So the answer is yes, there's still a lay leader, and yes, there's still a lay member to annual conference. However, they do not have to serve on this board. You do have your finance secretary and your treasurer. You still must have those as part of the operations of the church, but they do not have to serve on this board.
And in our case, our lay leader is also our lay delegate to annual conference. And that person does serve on our board. They also chair what I refer to as ministry table. So the group of leaders that lead different ministry teams. So Patrick, as our lay leader, also provides information back to SALT and serves as the liaison between SALT and the ministry table. And that's been really helpful for us.
And then, so with that understanding, of some of the same offices taking place, how then is things like, so there's still a treasurer who would then account for finances, for the offerings, for income and expenses. That question has come up a couple of times. So that hasn't changed.
Right.
Now, could you restate, we've had a couple of questions of how this meets the discipline requirements. So could you restate what paragraph that can be found?
Book of Discipline, paragraph 247.2.
247.2. And in a nutshell, what does 247.2 say?
Okay, hold on one second, and I can actually read it for you. Just give me.
Okay.
Let's see. Ooh, no. Go to the next question. I'll keep looking so we can actually get that.
Okay, let's go back up. First of all, someone wants to give a shout out to Donna, Claycomb, Sokol for your wisdom and your non-anxious presence. And I like to make sure I give the shout outs.
That person doesn't know me very well, do they? Meredith, I saw it. Thank you.
I wasn't going to call you out.
Non-anxious presence isn't always my forte.
So Donna, could you share one of your church goals and how you've reported on degrees of attainment?
Sure.
This person wants to see how far in the weeds the discussions can go.
Sure. So one of our church goals was the number of new members that we believe that we could receive in the new year. Another goal was recruiting 5 new small group leaders. It was having 40 people involved in a small group during the year. It was having 70% of our members involved in one form of ministry at the church. So those are samples. So many of them are goals that we can fairly easily see. Are we meeting this goal or are we not meeting this goal? Those are some examples. The amount that will reach the amount of, that will receive the amount of money that was pledged was another one that will continue to grow in our giving. But they're all goals that we can easily quantify and see if we're reaching them.
Excellent.
I'm ready.
You've got the other book.
I've got the other book. All right. And the other book, known as the Book of Discipline from 2016, says, the charge conference, the DS, and the pastor shall organize and administer the pastoral charge of churches according to the policies and plans. This is key right here. When the membership size, program scope, mission resources, or other circumstances so require, The charge conference may, in consultation with and upon approval of the DS, modify the organizational plans, provided that all of the provisions of paragraph 243 are observed. Such circumstances may include, but not limited to, alternative models for conception of a local church, coffee house ministries, small ministries, outdoor ministries, retirement, etc., and emergent ways in such people gather in God's name to the church. So what this says is, based upon the size of your church or the structure of your church, you may alter this to fit your church.
We have some sharp people. So somebody's got a very interesting question or comment,
Okay.
inviting us to be careful that under many current systems, the financial secretary and treasurer are automatically members of the finance committee. And so if this simplified accountable leadership structure is put into place and is called the finance committee, would they automatically be members of it?
No. They don't have to from my perspective, when we do our training, they do not have to automatically be members of the one board model. They could, but it's not automatic.
And who then are the voting, if it's not on it, who are the voting members of this one board?
The members of the one board.
So everyone.
But not
who
the
is-
pastor. The pastor.
Yeah, not the
doesn't-
pastor. The pastor does not have a vote. Thank you, Donna.
Okay. Now, Donna, you had mentioned some spiritual characteristics that you're looking for, and every church should develop what they're looking for. And one that you mentioned was giving. What if you were in a church where the culture of giving is treated as confidential?
Yep. So our culture of giving is also treated as confidential, and the pastor is given access to that information, which the book of Discipline also encourages, that the pastor should know what members are giving to the church. I believe the church is one of the few places that if I write a check for $1,000 and put it in the offering plate on Sunday, the church is one of the few places where people don't get thanked for that. If I write a check to my seminary and put it in the plate or put it in the mail tomorrow, I'm going to receive a thank you note next week. And so one of the things that I believe that the church continues to miss out on when pastors do not know what people are giving is the simple joy and privilege of saying thank you. Right now, we've been writing thank you notes for the people who are making pledges for next year. We also have been in the habit of giving a gift to people who make pledges, but I have people right now saying thank you for the thank you. Many people just saying thank you because the church hasn't thanked them in other places. So that's part of why we want to know. But it's also, why would you want someone to provide financial oversight of your congregation and do the determination and discernment around how your church is using the money that's been entrusted to you if that person isn't giving? Our team, our SALT team this year, for this year and last year, SALT, members of SALT have called our entire congregation during pledge season as well. And so all of our members of SALT have been given a list of members to call, and they don't ask for a pledge, but they thank people for their support. And they remind people when pledges are due and remind people of just the extraordinary thing that can happen when more and more of our members are becoming regular, intentional, and generous givers. And so, and we obviously, nominations doesn't have a list of people who are giving or who are not giving, but it could be if someone's name is mentioned as a potential member, the pastor could say something as simple as that person doesn't qualify, or I recommend that we continue to look for other people.
I'm going to brag on your church for a second, Donna.
Okay.
I get to worship at a lot of churches, both online and in person, and I've done both with your congregation. And when my spouse and I visit churches, we donate, and your congregation has been the most grateful and thanking church we've worshiped with. to receive a thank you note from the pastor and from lay people who, yes, I know because of my job, they've been assigned maybe that we want you to write thank you notes, but they're just so heartfelt. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that practice that you just described. And you all are living it. So thank you for your thank you. Thank you for your thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for thank
welcome.
you.
You're welcome. And once again, we've been turning around the term SALT. That stands for what again?
Strategy, accountability, and leadership table. Strategy, accountability, and leadership table.
Thank you. Now, as part of that, and you shared it with your agenda, who leads that section, Donna, on spiritual formation and leadership development?
I do the bulk of the time, but I really believe it should be a rotation, and I'm going to work on that this next year. So we've just finished our first 2 years of the simplified accountable structure. When we established the first group, we had a few people who had never served on SPRC or trustees or finance. I'll also say too, if this is helpful, that Mount Vernon Place had made the decision about 8 or 9 years ago to combine trustees and finance. And so we had already combined those two teams into something that we called SOURCE. We're big into acronyms. SOURCE stood for Stewardship of Resources Committee. And so we had made that decision about 8 or 9 years ago because of the complexities of how our budget is established. So we have a building that is used extensively by other organizations, and that makes up a significant or a portion of our budget. And so, and a seminary. And so we had made that decision to combine those two groups because it made sense for us. And so we had already had SOURCE, and then we moved into SALT. And now I'm forgetting why, wait, what, now I should have, I'm off topic. What was did I answer the question?
What does SALT stand for? You got it.
Goodness. Okay, so
you answered that in the beginning.
SOURCE,
you just gave us a little history of how you got to that point.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. How do you, as you're getting started with this, how do you handle the 3-year rotation? If everybody starts together, do they all stop together in 3 years? How do you handle to make sure there's some continuity? That question has come up a couple of times.
Yeah, so you're gonna, if you start, you're gonna have some people who are in a 1-year class, and you're gonna have some people in a 2-year class and some people in a 3-year class. And that's what I was trying to say. When we had taken some people who were serving on SOURCE, some people who were serving on SPRC, and then some people who were coming on SALT for the very first time. We then asked them to continue. So some of those people have served 4 years now between SALT and what they were serving before, because we didn't have any transitions this past year, which means that now moving into 2022, half of our team will be brand new because some of those people have discerned that they don't want to serve the 4th year, like we had asked them to minimize as many changes during the pandemic as possible. But that's how. So right now then too, we have someone new coming on. There was a spot for a 1-year term for 2022. So we have someone new coming on who has said yes to a 1-year term, one that's come on to say yes to a 2-year term, and then 3 people who are new who are coming on to a 3-year term.
Now, we've talked a lot about our smaller churches. I have a question from one of our larger churches. How would you respond to those who would push back, saying that their voice on the council, that if you move to the one board model, their voice on the council would now not be heard, and that more people, not less, should be invested and involved in decision making? How would you respond to that?
I'll take that one first, and then I'll toss the ball to you. So again, it's all about the mission. It's not about people being at the table so that my voice can be heard. It's about how do we come together in a collective group to focus on the mission of the church. Voices, everyone has a voice. They don't have a voice when they come to the leadership. They have a way to get it to the board. So it should not be 50 people trying to make a decision on what color the carpet should be. Or it should not be 50 people trying to make a decision on how much money we need to give to UMCOR this day. It should be a small, concise group who have been duly vetted, pray, discern, and have offered themselves to come together to administer, to order the life of the church. That's what it's about. Those other voices who want to be heard, we want them to be heard in the ministry. We want them to be heard in more ways that we can make more disciples. We don't need 50 people at the table for a council meeting. So we would encourage those people to do a leadership interest form. My interest may be teaching Sunday school. Well, if my interest is teaching Sunday school, then there may not be where I need to be on the leadership board. So therefore, I may want to go and to do the ministry of working with children or working with young adults or working with the community as a liaison for the schools. So again, we want to focus on the mission of the church, which is to make disciples. And everybody has a voice. Everybody wants to make disciples. But when it comes to ordering the life of the church, we should have a small, concise group that comes together and make those decisions. That's what I say.
Would you add anything, Donna?
I'm going to say amen.
Okay.
Amen.
We
And
have
I have several large churches in my district that utilize the one board model. And initially it was difficult because, I hate to say this term, we've always done it that way. I've always been on the council. I've always had this. And, I've had some pastors, well, we've got the list is at least 20, 30 people on the council. No, that is not the way that we order the life of the church. So yes, we should make sure that we explain to them it's all about accountability and making disciples.
Let's get some practical questions.
Okay.
So currently in this person's church, here's how clergy compensation is handled. The SPRC meets, they decide what the compensation for the upcoming year is going to be. They make a recommendation to the finance committee, who then debates it, and then they make a recommendation to the church council, who then takes it to church or charge conference. How would that change under the simplified accountable leadership structure?
You want me to take that one? Or you?
Go ahead, either way.
So it's real easy. We're all sitting around. And when it comes to clergy conversation, we become the SPRC. And we take this and we discuss it. And then guess what? The same people are there that are finance. Now we become finance. And we, instead of having another meeting to send it to another group, we're all there. And we discuss the finance there based upon the information that we together have discerned as SPRC. And then when it comes time for voting, we go and we become the council and we just vote on it right then and there. So we take care of it within that 59 minutes of meeting instead of having 3 separate meetings to get one decision.
You just said something that struck at another question. You said in that 59-minute meeting, somebody said, is the average time for your meetings 2 hours? How about the executive meeting? So how long are these meetings?
Go ahead, Donna.
Ours are an hour and a half, but they're always scheduled. So for the main meeting, and then they're scheduled for 2 hours because we always schedule 30 minutes for executive session. That doesn't always happen. But let me also say something about finance and compensation. Last June of 2020, our administrative person got a new job. So our administrative and communications coordinator, one of our full-time positions, got a job. It was June of 2020. And the entire SALT was fully aware of how much was unknown when it came to our finances. We'd never entered into a season like the one that we were in last June. And so we were very aware of how tenuous things were. We were aware of how little activity was happening in the building. And we were also aware of how much the church was likely about to change and not having any idea really what we most needed in that position. And so we had only been together as a team, as a SALT team for 6 months, but we had already worn these hats long enough to know that of course we weren't going to fill that position at that time. So it wasn't like SPRC immediately coming in and saying, well, we need this administrative person. This person plays a key role, which of course they do. But there were so many other unknowns that we had already navigated or started to navigate through in an April and May meeting 2 months into the pandemic, that when that happened, when that person left in June, it wasn't working through 3 different groups in a really, really uncertain time, but it was everybody already on the same table. Of course, there's not, there may not be money to fulfill this role. That ended up being information that would come later. Would giving be sustained, and what would that look like? But also there was this full awareness that we don't even know what we need in this role, given how much the church has changed already in these 2.5 or 3 months. So I feel like there's this awareness. People start to wear these hats very quickly. And especially when you are inviting them to think bigger about what the church can be. So when you're inviting them from the get-go to think bigger instead of smaller, then they start to wear these hats, and they start to be creative, and they start to be generative, and they really start to step into their roles in some pretty powerful and beautiful ways that have allowed us to be on one accord much earlier than I think I would have expected.
So you're just reminding me, and in all of that, I hear you saying that this one board is more responsive, it's more nimble, decisions can be thought through because you're not having to translate it from one committee to another committee to another committee, that people can really spend the time around that table to discern, to discuss. But is there ever conflict of interest with people wearing so many different hats? Like,
there hasn't been for us that I'm aware of. There really, I serve a very healthy congregation. I will say that. I serve a healthy church for which I'm profoundly grateful. I do not take that for granted.
So I'm going to take the reverse of that then. If your church, if a congregation is not in a healthy place, is that the time to move to this kind of a model?
I think that's a good question, because you're going to have to develop trust. And I don't know how long that takes in every place to develop trust.
And so I would say the same thing that Donna said. If they're not in a healthy place, you need to determine why are they not healthy, and how did they get to that place. And going into a new structure like this and you're unhealthy may not be the best thing to do at this time. You need to get healthy first.
Some more practical questions. How do they handle your evaluation, Donna? Are you present during the SPRC times? Do they have to notify you if they're going to meet without you, like our discipline requires for SPRC? How are those things handled in your situation?
Sure. So we worked on my evaluation in August and September, and the group worked on that. I'm not part of that conversation. I don't think that's appropriate for me to be part of that conversation. And so in that case, we started with executive session, and then I excused myself so that they could work on the evaluation. Many of them, in our case, many of them had already worked on it individually, and then they came through to consolidate all of their answers. So I was excused when they were consolidating the answers, and then I was brought back together to offer that evaluation. I will also say, though, that I believe the board knows me better than any SPRC has ever known me, because they're seeing me on a monthly basis. They're also seeing my concerns, my pain, my struggle around finances, building, where the church is today as we continue to walk through the pandemic together. And so they are seeing my response and how the questions I'm asking in all of those areas about giving, about worship, about the use of our property, about our building. They're seeing me lead in the full areas of every aspect of the church, and no SPRC's ever been able to do that. They see a portion of who I am or what I do. And then to be super transparent and being able to name and articulate just how hard this season has been. I really cannot imagine walking through the past 20 months without a board that has been so supportive and so quick to listen to the fullness of my concerns, as well as my hope and anticipation for what might emerge as we continue to emerge from the pandemic.
And so you bring up a good point of how well this particular team at your church works together. Do you see, has there been any loss in terms of losing expertise from people who have been serving on those previous committees for long? I mean, is there a, lack of a better word, cost benefit analysis of, we've had all these people with expertise, but now we have a board that's more nimble and supportive?
So prayerfully, you never lose the expertise. Prayerfully, expertise is always a phone call away or a conversation away. It may just mean that the expertise is not in the room at a board meeting. So the expertise prayerfully never goes away. I will say that our cost, we lost 2 people who had been core leaders who weren't invited to serve on our main board when we made this transition. We made the transition pretty quickly. It was not nearly as long as what Kay outlines in the book, and not as long as what Dr. Cogman has just outlined for us. So we made it much more quickly. And in doing so, I believe we did lose 2 people, and 2 people who were hurt by not being invited to serve on the new board. So that there may be some bruised feelings and some people who don't understand at first, which is why I believe that this transparency and communication is so incredibly important throughout the whole process of discernment and the vote that will lead to you making this transition.
And so as part of your leadership development, then, do you help people become more knowledgeable around these? If I've never served on a trustees or finance committee, but I meet all of those other things you're looking for, how do you get me up to speed on the particulars of a trustee or a finance section of a meeting?
Okay.
We're looking at that right now as we bring on half new people onto our board. So we are really looking at what were the missteps that we took last time where we failed to really talk about the fullness of the responsibility. And so what does a full orientation look like? But I've learned that we need to teach people how to read financial reports. We need to teach people the different pockets of responsibility. So what does it mean to have fiduciary responsibility for the congregation? What does it mean to provide stewardship of the building or invested funds? What does that look like? What does it mean to be part of staff parish relations? What does it mean to hold a pastor accountable? And what does it mean for me to be willing to be accountable as the person who's joining this team? So right now we're really looking carefully about what does a full orientation look like, and what do we want to make sure that we make sure, what do we try to make sure that that we're operating on the same page.
I would answer the same thing, because when people, before they changed to the one board model, they would have to be trained in finance or SPRC or trustees. And each district, I know we used to have leadership days that all of that training was available. So now with the one board model, from my district specifically, we ensure that when people come over, they are trained and they know what a zero balance budget is. They know how to read the financial reports. They know what the SPRC is. So training is very important.
Trying to translate this question. So we have somebody who was part of a congregation where there was a lack of transparency. Some people felt like they were left in the dark. So people started attending the meetings that were open, and they knew they didn't have a vote, but they could express their interest, their concerns, their praises. can people still attend these simple accountable leadership board meetings and speak their concerns, their celebrations, their sorrows, their joys? Can they still attend and have a voice even though they don't have a vote, except for the closed SPRC? Is that permittable under this model?
So I don't know how Donna, and she may do it differently with her SALT team, and I will let her do that. But what I encourage my people to do is that, again, understanding there is a specific role for this one board model, okay, which is order the life of the church. We do not take away anybody's voice. So if someone has something they want to bring to the board that has to do with aligning with the mission, ordering the life of the church, then we will have an avenue in our guidelines that say, this is how you get it to the table. But you mentioned things like celebrations, or they're having some issues, or whatever the case might be, that is not mission driven, then that's a different venue that we would guide them to. So, because our agenda is set, as you saw with Donna. So we have an agenda. This is our agenda. And I like to tell my people, we don't let people come in and railroad our agenda. So we have our agenda that is set. And if there is an issue that needs to be addressed by this board, then fine. But if it's something that does not have to do with ordering the life of the church or the mission, then we will send them to another venue.
Okay. So there are a number of, we're going to go with the last question. There are a number of very specific, and I'll get to that and say, but here, last question. How do you incorporate the younger generation in the one board model?
So we do encourage, as the Book of Discipline says, that you have young adults as well as youth. So that's when you can go from 9 to 12 to 15. All right. And you can determine if you want to have a young adult or youth on there. If you have a youth, then please understand when it comes to the trustees, anyone under the age of 18, we have to be careful with that. When it comes to contracts, they are not allowed to sign contracts or that type of thing. But we do want to encourage our youth and young adults, because they should be part of ordering the life of the church. So I highly encourage them to be part of the one board model if the church has that availability.
Okay.
And my board chair is 35 years old.
Amen.
I am going to ask your permission in a minute. If people have questions that have not been answered, is it permissible to share? Whoops, I just did. So I just shared your email accidentally with my big hands. Hit send, except for just part of Dr. Cogman's video, email. So I'm sharing your email. It was on one of the slides, so I thought it'd be okay. So it's donna@mvpumc.org, and Johnsie Cogman is at jcogman@bwcumc.org. If people want to look in their chat, if you can't copy and paste it, write it down. That information is in there. Some great questions and some great concerns. And I know we've covered this topic a couple of times on Training Tuesdays, and people have the same trepidation of trying something new. Do you regret it, Donna?
No, and I just want to say something about that. Almost everything is new since March 15th of 2020. The only thing that we're doing at the same time is we're worshiping at 11 o'clock. But I think about all of the newness that this season has brought on, and I think we've only hit the tip of the iceberg, that none of us really know what the church is going to look like in 2 years, let alone 5 years, let alone 10 years. And how do we embrace this particular season and the opportunity that we have in this season to experiment, and to experiment wildly, and to not be afraid of failure, and to not be afraid of disappointing people, but to really live into, most of us were offered a clean slate. And some of us, I know, are part of churches where it feels like the bulk of people are back. And some of us, we went to a third of where, we have a third of the people in our sanctuary that we had in March of 2020. But I know this, that our trying to continue to do everything we were doing in February 2020 is going to lead to failure, because the church has changed way too much since January, February, March of 2020. So my biggest encouragement would be the tides are changing and the boat is rocking, and it's not been tipped over, but it's almost been tipped over. So capitalize on this particular moment that we have to try new things, to live into what we pray will be God's intended future. And if it doesn't work out, then just keep trying. But how do we all really seize this opportunity to experiment?
So I would like to echo the same thing that Reverend Sokol said, that we need to understand that things have changed and things will continue to change. And the only way we do that is, like she said, is to live into that change. I, as a district superintendent, began in kind of spreading the seed a little bit to all of my churches back in 2019 about the one board model, as I had done it before when Kay had the very first book, Mission Possible. I'm a very big proponent of working smarter and not harder. And especially when you have people that are, they're out 4 and 5 days a week, and we're doing this, we're tired, and we're not getting ministry done. So I really stress to all of my churches to please try to look into it. I had meetings with them. I had congregational meetings with them. And I'm very excited to say that out of my 60 plus churches, I have well over 1/2 now that are implemented or that have implemented the one board model. So just like Reverend Sokol today gave you information on what they do with the SALT and different terminology, there are several churches that have already done this. So if you want to talk to someone who felt the fear and did it anyway, then let us know. We will be here to support you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank the two of you for taking the time to lead us tonight. I always enjoy having you both. You both have done this separately. Having you together has just been double the blessing. So thank you so much. I've been just getting a lot of great comments in the Q&A of people how worth their time this has been. So thank you so much. This is our last training Tuesday of 2021. We're going to leave you with a cliffhanger. You are going to want to tune in for our first training Tuesday of 2022. I know, because of the role I play in the annual conference as the director of innovative evangelism, that we have a variety of churches in both annual conferences, I'm sure, and across the denomination. We have churches who are just firing on all cylinders, very thriving and healthy, and are ready to launch new forms of ministry, or maybe new churches or new worship services. We have churches that are not thriving, that are struggling and just need a little help to get over that hump. We have other churches that are starting to really decline and just need some help to turn around a little bit. And I know we also have churches that are actively dying, for lack of a better word, and just don't know where to turn. And so we are going to be sponsoring for both annual conferences what we're calling Congregational Vitality Pathways. And we're going to have a webinar on January 4th that's going to describe all of the congregational vitality pathways, with the idea to help your congregation discern and discover and take your next faithful step. And those 4 pathways are the Launch Initiative, which will be designed for churches who are ready to launch out with either a new worship service or a new faith community someplace or a new campus. We have the Catalyst Initiative, is just to help those churches that are struggling but are ready to take a next step towards health and thriving. We're going to have the Readiness Initiative for churches that are struggling and just don't know where to turn. And we're going to have a Legacy Church Conversation Initiative to help those churches who are declining to such a point they don't know what else to do, and we want to have conversations to help them discern what their next steps are. And so during this webinar, you're going to learn about all of the pathways. You're going to learn how to apply. We're going to have cohorts, we're going to have guides, we're going to have training. Some of these will last for 6 months, some will last for a whole year. I'm going to put in the chat a website that explains all of the different pathways. It's on the Baltimore-Washington Conference website right now, and either conference can get to it. If you can't click on the link in the chat, just look under the menu under New Faith Expressions, Congregational Development, and you will find a description of all the vitality pathways. And at least on the Baltimore-Washington Conference website, you can register for the webinar now. And I know that on the Peninsula Delaware Conference website, that registration will be coming shortly. This is a massive undertaking that we are launching into to help our congregations just take their next faithful step. And so I want to encourage everybody to attend that webinar. But again, thank you both for coming tonight and presenting. Thank you for our several hundred participants and your great questions and your great comments and even your concerns and your warnings. We take them all to heart. Again, we've recorded tonight. It will be available on both conference websites by the end of the week. The slides will be available on both conference websites by the end of the week. And if you have particular questions, please reach out to our two presenters. So have a wonderful evening. God bless you all and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.